The soft morning light slipped through the tall glass windows, spreading into thin golden strips across the marble floor. Margaret Hale stood still in front of an oil painting of a winter sea, the warm eyes of the 64-year-old woman fixed on the cold gray-blue water. She had always loved mornings like this, quiet, undisturbed, with nothing but art and the whisper of history inside the Redwood Harbor Museum. She was about to lean in to study the brushwork when she suddenly sensed a slight movement beside her. A woman in a beige wool coat, impeccably dressed, stood next to her as if she, too, were admiring the painting. Without turning her head, the woman, somewhere in her early 50s, gentle-looking but sharp-eyed, slipped a small piece of paper into Margaret's palm. Her voice was barely a breath. "Stay calm. Smile. And leave when I leave." Margaret opened the note, feeling her hand tremble. Before she could react, the stranger, Clara Whitford, as she introduced herself with a faint smile, tilted her head as though discussing the painting's color palette. "Someone is following you," Clara whispered. "The man by the wood-carving exhibit. Don't look back." Margaret's heart lurched. She kept her head still, but shifted her gaze enough to catch a blurred reflection in the glass case nearby. And then she nearly dropped her purse. Vincent Crowell. The long face, the cold eyes, the familiar gray suit. Her son's former business partner. The man Ethan had said moved to Thailand months ago to open a new office, yet he was standing here, looking in her direction. Margaret swallowed hard, her whole body tightening like a string pulled to its limit. If you're listening to this story, remember to hit subscribe so you don't miss more unbelievable true stories like this. Now, back to Margaret. Margaret followed Clara into a narrow hallway that led to the museum's outdoor sculpture garden. Clara stopped beside a stone bench, arms crossed, scanning the area before speaking. "Now you can breathe," Clara murmured, "but we don't have much time." Margaret gripped her purse straps. "Who are you? Why is Vincent following me?" Clara handed her a small silver card. "Clara Whitford, private investigator, and yes, I'm working for Vincent Crowell." Margaret's eyes widened as she stepped back half a pace. "He hired you to follow me." "No," Clara replied quickly. "I was hired to follow your son." A chill ran down Margaret's spine. Clara continued, her voice firm but gentle. "In 3 minutes, we walk out of here. Follow me and act like we're just museum visitors chatting about art. Understood?" Margaret nodded. But the question churned in her mind like crashing waves. Why would Lucas be involved in this? During the 3 minutes waiting for Clara's signal, Margaret felt herself slipping into a stream of memories she couldn't stop. 10 years earlier, her husband, Daniel Hale, collapsed from a sudden heart attack. Daniel had been a meticulous man, working in property appraisal for over 20 years. Many nights he hunched over thick stacks of files, trying to uphold honesty in a field where the money was often too tempting. "Nearly 30 years in this job, do you know what makes me proudest?" Daniel once asked. "What is it?" "That every report I sign, I can look the client in the eye without feeling ashamed." The memory tightened around Margaret's heart. She remembered his gentle face, warm hands, and the way he spoke to their 3 children each night, as if the whole world revolved around their family. And now, that same family was the very thing unsettling her the most. Her 3 children. Eleanor, a lawyer in Chicago, is logical to the point of emotional coldness. The 2 rarely spoke beyond formal pleasantries. Lucas, 37, a real estate entrepreneur, praised by everyone, successful, ambitious. Ben, the youngest, was a kind-hearted high school history teacher in Pinebridge, so trusting that he was sometimes naive. And she, Margaret, still living in her small Pinebridge home, tending her garden, doing her errands, fixing her own faucets. Proud and discreet. The sort of woman who disliked troubling others and refused to become a burden. That was why, when Clara mentioned Lucas, it felt as if someone had squeezed her heart. Clara leaned closer, her voice dropping to nearly nothing. Vincent was conned, Mrs. Hale. By Lucas. Margaret froze. No, that can't be true. I'm sorry, but it is. Clara met her eyes. Lucas embezzled $1.8 million from Vincent using a forged dissolution agreement tied to their new firm, North Star Advisory Group. Margaret shook her head, struggling for breath. Worse, Clara continued. Vincent received threats aimed at his daughter. Photos, anonymous emails. Someone wants him silent. Margaret felt her knees weaken. Why would Lucas do that? She whispered, as though begging Clara to deny it. Clara didn't. I followed Lucas for 2 months. Secret meetings, untraceable bank accounts, men I've never seen connected to his company. Something is wrong, Mrs. Hale. Very wrong. Margaret pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her heartbeat falter. Clara looked at her with genuine empathy. I know this is hard, but you need to know, and we need to leave before Vincent approaches you. He's desperate, and desperate people are unpredictable. Margaret took a deep breath, her hands ice cold. All right, I'll go with you. Clara nodded and stepped forward, signaling her to follow. From this moment on, trust no one, Clara said. Not until we know the whole truth about Lucas. The small cafe sat right across from the museum, the kind of place visitors stopped by for a latte while admiring the distant view of Redwood Bay. Clara chose a secluded corner table, her back to the window, her eyes never stopping their quiet surveillance of everyone who walked in. Margaret sat down slowly, her hands still trembling slightly after the tension she had just endured. Now you can open that note, Clara said softly. Margaret took out the slip of paper. It was small, thin, folded in half, still holding the faint scent of polished wood from the exhibit room. She inhaled deeply and unfolded it. Just a few lines, yet each one felt like a cold blade. Lucas didn't buy back the shares. He deceived me. I'm watching your family because you're the only one who might tell me the truth I need. Trust no one. VC. Margaret let her hand fall to the table, the paper trembling with her breath. Vincent thinks you know something, Clara said. Or at least, he believes you're not like Lucas. No, Lucas isn't like that. Margaret shook her head, though her voice lacked conviction. My son, he wouldn't do something like this. Clara remained silent, allowing Margaret to confront her own thoughts. Margaret clasped her hands tightly, and then, like a rising tide, small memories, things she had once brushed aside, began resurfacing. The first was a summer evening last year. Lucas had stopped by the house for barely 15 minutes, saying he came just to cheer her up. But throughout the visit, he kept glancing at his watch, his foot tapping the floor as if waiting for someone. You're working too much, Margaret had told him. You don't need to. I'm fine, Mom, Lucas had cut in, forcing a thin smile. Just a lot of calls to handle. But his phone had been on silent mode. She remembered that clearly. Then came another Sunday afternoon when Margaret brought up the new office Lucas had boasted about the week before, the headquarters of North Star Advisory Group. I'll stop by sometime, she said. Lucas hesitated as if she had suggested something troublesome. The place is being renovated. It's a mess. Once it's done, I'll take you, he replied, his eyes shifting away. But 6 months had passed, and Lucas had never mentioned it again. And there was the dinner in March, when Lucas arrived with an expensive bottle of wine. He hugged her longer than usual, looking tired and strained. Is something wrong, Lucas? Margaret asked. He pressed his lips together before offering a smile, the kind of strained smile any mother could recognize. No, just work pressure. But back then, she'd convinced herself it was nothing unusual. She hadn't wanted to doubt her son. Now, in the little cafe, those memories wavered in her mind like scattered puzzle pieces, finally finding their place. Mrs. Hale? Clara said quietly. You see it now, don't you? Those changes weren't without reason. Margaret tightened her grip on Vincent's note. Nothing breaks a mother's heart more than doubting her own child. Clara met her gaze steadily, but sometimes the truth begins exactly from that doubt. Margaret swallowed the tightness in her throat. She didn't want to believe it, but deep down, she knew what once seemed like a tiny crack was widening into a visible fracture. The cafe grew more crowded as noon approached, but Clara leaned forward, shielding the space between them as though even the surrounding noise could turn into dangerous leaks. "Now comes the harder part," Clara said, sliding a thin file toward Margaret. "I brought this summary in case Vincent changes his mind or cuts contact." Margaret opened the file. Lines of text, numbers, unfamiliar names. It felt like she was stepping into a world she had never imagined her son might be part of. "North Star Advisory Group isn't a real company," Clara began, pointing at the first page. "No office, no staff, just a rented address in Portland that's been closed for 3 months." "That can't be—" "Lucas said they were expanding," Margaret whispered. "They expanded on paper." Clara turned to the next page. "These are North Star's loan documents. They used extremely valuable assets as collateral, but according to county records, those assets don't exist." Margaret looked at the list. 1330 Garden Ridge Lane, a plot of land that doesn't exist. Sunset Vista Tower Project, never approved. Lakeshore Estates, a fabricated subdivision plan. Each line stabbed deeper into her heart. "Lucas signed as company representative," Clara said. "He's been doing this for months, and Vincent, he's the guarantor on some of these loans, unaware they were backed by phantom assets." Margaret shook her head, struggling to breathe. "Lucas? He wouldn't take a risk like this. He's always been careful." "Careful with whom?" Clara asked quietly. "Or only with the people he truly values?" Margaret couldn't answer. Clara stepped out to make an urgent call, leaving Margaret with a growing sense that she needed to take action, that sitting still was no longer an option. So she drove to the Redwood Harbor Library, the one place that always calmed her when her thoughts felt tangled. The young librarian, Amelia, recognized her immediately. "Mrs. Hale, how can I help?" "I want to look up some property records," Margaret said, trying to keep her voice steady. Amelia led her to the archive room where county property PDFs and real estate data were neatly organized by year. Margaret typed North Star Advisory Group. Only a few results appeared, all rejected permit applications. She tried the name Clara had mentioned, Brighthaven Holdings, LLC. This time, dozens of records flooded the screen, opening like a door she wasn't ready to walk through. Every phantom property North Star used for loans was registered under Brighthaven. And what chilled Margaret even more? Brighthaven's legal representative, Harold Denton. The same name Lucas had told her to contact for estate planning just a few weeks earlier. This couldn't be a coincidence. Margaret closed her eyes. A memory flashed. Lucas standing in her kitchen, speaking softly. "Just making sure your assets are protected in case anything happens." She'd felt touched back then, thinking her son was looking out for her. Now she understood. He might have been laying groundwork for something else entirely. Margaret opened the old document pouch she kept in her car, Daniel's files which she could never bring herself to discard. Among appraisal reports and client lists, she found a small note, the paper yellowed with age. Redwood's development project. Requested 20% value increase. Refused to sign. D. Margaret felt her heart drop. Redwood's development. The name was chillingly familiar. She dug further. A printed email, its date faded. "Mr. Hale, remember who is backing this project. Don't make things difficult." Signed. G.P. Margaret whispered. Gerald Pike. The head of Redwood's development is a man known for his power and ruthlessness in Oregon real estate for over 2 decades. Daniel had refused to inflate the appraisal on Pike's project, and only months later, he died of a sudden heart attack. Margaret steadied her breath, her hand resting on the old folder, her mind churning like stormy waves. Daniel, was it really just an accident? She asked herself, but didn't dare answer. Clara had warned her, we must be careful with every assumption. But now, with the truth about Lucas, North Star, Brighthaven, Harold Denton, and now Gerald Pike, everything began aligning like red threads converging toward a single point. And Margaret understood. The truth about Lucas might only be the tip of the iceberg, and the truth about Daniel's death might be waiting deep beneath the surface. That afternoon, after leaving the library and driving back to Pine Bridge, Margaret felt a heavy weight in her chest. The sky had turned gray, the distant sea a strip of cold steel. She stopped the car in front of her house, her hand trembling slightly as she opened the mailbox by the gate. Inside was only one large manila envelope, with no return address. Her name was printed on it in a perfectly mechanical, chilling hand. Margaret carried the envelope into the kitchen. She sat down and used scissors to slice the adhesive. When she pulled out the first sheet, it felt as if her heart stopped. Deed of Transfer of Residential Property, Grantee, Brighthaven Holdings, LLC. Below it was her signature. A complete signature. Correct name, correct strokes, the right slant, but she had never signed it. No, this can't be, Margaret whispered, her hand shaking so the edge of the paper fluttered. She scanned the dateline. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago. She'd been in Portland with Ben to watch his students' recital. There was no way she had signed a deed transferring her house at that time. Margaret rifled through the next sheet, a receipt of funds. Total amount $230,000. Payment in cash. She cried out, I never received a cent. As panic surged, her phone rang. It was Clara. Mrs. Hale, I need to see you now, Clara said when Margaret answered. Clara's voice was unusually urgent. You got the envelope, didn't you? Margaret inhaled sharply. Clara, my signature. Someone has forged it. And very professionally. Clara cut her off. Brighthaven doesn't sign transfer deeds without Harold Denton's direction. I suspect Lucas prepared the ground for the next step. The next step? Meaning what? Clara was silent for a few seconds, then spoke, her tone hard. Lucas is preparing guardianship papers for you, Margaret. It felt like a slap. Guardianship meant she would lose control over her assets, including the house. Everything would belong to the guardian, and if this deed were accepted as genuine, she would have nothing left. But how could this happen? I'm perfectly lucid, Margaret tried to say, her voice breaking. Lucas had a family doctor produce a psychological evaluation for you, Clara said rapidly, and there's more. I've uncovered it. What is it? Someone at Pine Bridge Bank was bribed. Your cash transaction history has been altered. In the revised records, it appears you received $230,000 from Brighthaven 3 weeks ago. Margaret gripped the table edge. But I know, Clara said. But on paper, it looks convincing enough for judges to believe. Lucas has prepared everything. The transfer of phantom assets, the psychological report, proof you received the money, all to show you are incapable of managing your finances and to put everything into his hands. Margaret glanced around her familiar kitchen, her hand-embroidered dish towel, the photo of Daniel on the small table. Everything suddenly felt as fragile as tissue. Clara, why would Lucas do this to me? Clara was silent for a long time before answering. Because Lucas is about to collapse, Mrs. Hale. And desperate people can do things they never imagined. Margaret closed her eyes, one hand over her heart, feeling it contract as if to hide the spreading pain. There was one thing she had never imagined. Not only was Vincent watching her son had been setting a trap around her life for a long time. That evening, Pine Bridge lay under a thin veil of mist, the streetlights casting a yellow glow on the quiet road so that Margaret could hear the wind through the row of cedars in front of her house. She had barely set down her cup of tea when the doorbell rang. Margaret opened the door. Eleanor stood there, neat, composed, her long black coat still damp with mist. "I came as soon as Lucas called," Eleanor said, stepping inside without further questions. "Mother, we need to talk." Eleanor's voice wasn't cold, but it had the edge of someone who had lived too long in the law. She set her bag down and produced a neatly clipped file. "I know you've been under a lot of stress," Eleanor began, "but what Lucas showed me, you must understand it's serious." Margaret felt her chest grow heavy. "My daughter, I'm perfectly fine. Lucas is making... Mother." Eleanor put a gentle but firm hand on her shoulder. "This is the email you supposedly sent to the bank last week, a confirmation that you received the transfer." Margaret looked at the paper. The email was exactly in her style. The address, the signature, and even her usual opening, "Kind regards, Margaret Hale," had been copied perfectly, but she had never written a word of it. "Mother, you didn't send this," Margaret said, voice trembling. Eleanor frowned. "Then who used your account?" "And there's this." She handed over a psychological assessment from Dr. Smith, the doctor who had examined their family years ago. Conclusion: the patient shows signs of short-term memory decline, mild paranoia, and instability in managing personal finances. Margaret was stunned. "This is forged." Eleanor didn't reply immediately. She sighed, her voice falling. "Mother, Lucas also said you once left the stove on and nearly caused a fire. And when a neighbor saw you standing in the yard at night, you didn't recognize them." Margaret recoiled. "That never happened." Eleanor pressed her lips together, not with anger, but as someone unsure what to believe. About an hour later, Margaret's living room was packed. Lucas, standing by the window, arms folded, a face mixed with anxiety and control. Marina, Lucas's new wife, eyes avoiding Margaret. Ben, the youngest, sitting close to his mother, restless and clearly uncomfortable. Eleanor, holding the stack of documents as if preparing for a hearing. "Okay," Lucas said smoothly, "we're here to help you. Nobody wants things to get worse." Margaret fought to remain calm. "Lucas, what have you done with my house?" Lucas sighed as if speaking to someone lacking patience. "You signed, you just don't remember. We have proof." "You're lying," Margaret snapped, but immediately felt Marina's pitying look, Eleanor's confused glance, and Ben's bowed head. Lucas signaled someone behind him. Dr. Smith entered with a leather briefcase in hand like a blade. "Good evening, Mrs. Hale," he said in a tone so soft it was almost incredulous. "I'm here at the family's request to perform a preliminary evaluation. We only want to ensure you're okay." "You know I'm fine," Margaret said, choking. Lucas interrupted. "We only want to be sure. You've shown signs of instability, and your apparent memory loss at the time of a major transaction makes me extremely worried." Margaret laughed, a laugh of pain. "You're worried about me, or about the money?" Lucas tightened his jaw. "I don't want to take legal steps, but if you continue like this..." Those legal steps meant guardianship, Margaret knew all too well. Ben grabbed his mother's hand and whispered, "I believe you. But Lucas says there's evidence." But there was one thing nobody knew. Margaret was recording everything. Before the family arrived, Clara had stopped by for a brief 3 minutes and handed her a small recorder the size of a tie clip. "If they try to push you into guardianship," Clara said, "you need proof. Real proof, not the evidence they fabricated." Margaret clipped it under her cardigan. What weighed on her most was not the confrontation. It was having to take back the words of her own son, Lucas, whom she had once believed had a heart as good as Daniel's. As Lucas continued to speak about the danger she might pose to herself, his tone grew so cold that even an outsider listening would have mistaken it for concern. Margaret felt hot tears well up, but held them back, squeezing Ben's hand to keep herself upright. "Lucas," she said softly, "why are you doing this to me?" Lucas looked at her, his eyes lacking the warmth they once had, because you can no longer care for yourself. Clara had been right. When people are desperate, they can shape lies into the sweetest words. Margaret brushed the corner of her eye. She was not only fighting to keep her house, she was fighting to keep the truth and the honor of her family. 3 days after the family intervention, as a heavy gray sky settled over Pine Bridge, Clara called Margaret near midnight. "Mrs. Hale, Vincent has reached out," Clara said quickly. "He wants to meet, and this time, he says there's something Margaret needs to see." Margaret gripped the phone. "Where?" "The abandoned warehouse on the Newport waterfront. Tomorrow morning. But you won't go alone." "You mean, I'll come with you and one other person." The next morning, the Newport wind blew so hard that Margaret's hair streamed wildly. The warehouse sat isolated behind an old parking lot, its rusted sign tilting in the wind. Clara parked at the building's edge. "Vincent's inside," she said. "He sounds panicked, but coherent." Margaret looked around and felt a chill run down her spine. A man in a black coat stepped out of another car. An FBI badge peeked beneath his jacket. "Margaret Hale?" he asked in a low voice. "I'm Agent Ruiz. You don't know us, but we've been monitoring Lucas Hale's financial activity for 4 months. Margaret's eyes widened. "The FBI? Watching my son?" Ruiz nodded. "We suspect he's involved in a money laundering network and real estate manipulation, but we don't have a clear link between Lucas and the figure behind it, Gerald Pike. If Vincent truly has documents, that could be the key." Margaret clenched her hands. "Then let's go in." Inside the warehouse, Vincent stood against the wall, noticeably thinner. He was a far cry from the confident man he once was. Dark circles under his eyes, his hands trembling slightly. "Mrs. Hale," he breathed, "I'm sorry for dragging you into this, but I have no one else to trust." Vincent handed Clara a bag of documents, then looked at Margaret. "Lucas didn't just deceive me, he deceived you too." Clara opened the bag. Inside were 1. Bank transfer records. 2. Showing large sums moving from North Star to Brighthaven, then straight into the accounts of Redwood's development, Gerald Pike's company. 3. A USB containing video. 4. Ruiz plugged it into a laptop he'd brought. 5. Footage from a building camera near Margaret's house displayed. 6. Lucas and Marina broke into Margaret's house at 2:37 a.m. The time the forged transfer documents appeared, Margaret covered her mouth. "My God!" 3. Photos of secret meetings. 4. Lucas is sitting in a car with Gerald Pike, no longer conjecture. Ruiz nodded. "Exactly the kind of evidence we need." Margaret looked at Vincent, voice choked. "How did you get all this?" "Because I was part of it, in a small way," Vincent admitted. "But when they started threatening my daughter, I had to run. I collected everything before I escaped." He looked at Margaret with painful eyes. "I watched you because I thought you were the one person Lucas wouldn't dare harm." A sound came from the warehouse door. Ruiz gestured for silence. The door opened a crack. A tall man entered. Silver hair, perfect suit, a thin smile. Gerald Pike. "Whitford, Ruiz, and Mrs. Hale." Pike spoke slowly. "I didn't expect to meet this way." Ruiz moved his hand toward his jacket, but Pike raised both hands. "Don't worry. I have no weapon. I only came to offer some advice." He stepped closer, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Older people tend to believe in the good, and it is their kindness that makes them easiest to exploit." He paused, looking Margaret up and down, but sometimes that very kindness is what makes plans fall apart. Clara stepped forward. "Pike, you have no right to be here." Pike only smiled. "You will soon learn. No one truly has rights in this game." Then he turned and left like a cold wind sweeping through the room. Ruiz grabbed his radio. "Surveillance unit, target exiting the warehouse. Follow." When the door closed, Clara took Margaret's hand. "Mrs. Hale, now we have what Lucas cannot deny." Margaret nodded, but her eyes held more than panic. They held a deep, aching sorrow. Her son had gone too far. So far she wasn't sure he could come back. On the morning of the hearing, Pine Bridge's sky was leaden, matching Margaret's mood as she entered the county courthouse. The hallway was crowded, shoes and file covers echoing in the anxious air. She straightened her navy coat, the one Daniel had called the most elegant, and stepped into the courtroom. On the other side, Lucas sat with his lawyer, Harold Denton, and his wife, Marina. Lucas seemed unnervingly calm. Marina looked at Margaret with a mixture of pity and triumph. Eleanor sat directly behind them, her face composed but with a flicker of uncertainty. Ben sat beside Margaret, nodding subtly, as if to signal she was not alone. Judge Justine Porter, stern but fair, banged her gavel. "We will begin. The court wishes to hear why the family seeks an emergency guardianship for Mrs. Margaret Hale." Harold Denton rose, his voice measured and cutting. "Your Honor, we present evidence that Mrs. Hale has displayed multiple signs of cognitive incapacity, including paranoid family delusions, dangerous behavior, and an inability to manage her assets." He cast a glance at Margaret, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. Then he called 3 doctors. The first doctor, one who had been bought by Lucas to create a false file. "Patient. I'm sorry, Mrs. Hale. Shows signs of confusion, distraction, and memory errors." The second doctor. "Suspected mild delusional disorder." The third doctor. "She has repeatedly called about medications never prescribed. All presented smoothly, seamlessly, as if rehearsed. When Eleanor was called, she stood straight, as if in a courtroom in Chicago. Based on the documents I saw, I believe my mother has cognitive issues. I just want her protected." Margaret looked at her daughter. Eleanor was not cruel. She simply trusted paper more than she trusted her feelings, like Daniel once did. Margaret's heart ached. Margaret's attorney, Rachel Mendez, 29, quick and bright-eyed, spoke next. "Your Honor," Rachel said, "what concerns me is not my client's health, but the motives of those seeking guardianship." The courtroom murmured. Rachel questioned the first doctor. "You claim Mrs. Hale is confused. Do you have voice recordings or video to prove it?" I did not bring any." "So today you have no visual evidence?" "No." The second doctor fared no better when Rachel pointed out, "You never examined Mrs. Hale in person, correct?" The doctor blushed. "Correct. A supposed expert who had never met the patient." The courtroom buzzed when Rachel addressed Harold Denton. "Mr. Denton, how long have you known Lucas Hale?" "About a year. And you represent Brighthaven Holdings, LLC, correct?" Harold flinched. "I have handled some matters." "Matters involving non-existent properties?" Harold fell silent. Rachel smiled faintly. A precise strike. "Mrs. Hale," the judge asked, "would you like to speak?" Margaret rose, slowly, with resolve. "Your Honor, I am not here to argue with my children," she began. "I am here to protect my family from the very mistakes they have been drawn into." She produced the file Ruiz had authorized her to present. "These are bank records showing money from North Star Advisory Group flowed into Gerald Pike's company, the very man the FBI is investigating for financial fraud." Lucas leapt up. "Mother is—" "Sit down." The judge's tone was firm. Margaret took out the USB. Rachel plugged it into the court computer and played the video. Lucas and Marina broke into Margaret's house at 2:37 a.m. The courtroom fell silent. Margaret continued, "I do not accuse my son out of anger, but out of truth." She opened Daniel's old folder and her voice, steady but slow, read, "Daniel, my husband, once wrote, 'The easiest way is not always the right way, but if we ignore the truth, we lose ourselves.'" She looked at Lucas, eyes wet but voice steel strong. "My son has lost himself." Lucas looked down, his hands trembling. The courtroom door suddenly burst open. Agent Ruiz and 3 FBI agents entered. "Your Honor," Ruiz said, "we have warrants to arrest Lucas Hale, Marina Hale, Harold Denton, and Gerald Pike on charges of financial fraud, elder fraud, money laundering, and forging legal documents." The sound of handcuffs clinking echoed. Marina screamed and cried. Harold went pale. Lucas stood frozen, as if the ground had opened beneath him. Eleanor covered her face. Ben stood motionless. The judge hammered her gavel one last time. "The petition for guardianship is denied. All Mrs. Hale's assets remain protected. Court is adjourned." Margaret squeezed Rachel's hand, not for triumph, but for the fractured heartache, watching her son taken away. Lucas's eyes met hers. Confusion, anger, then remorse. But it was too late. A week after the hearing, Oregon newspapers were filled with reports about the arrests tied to the real estate fraud network, with Lucas Hale and Marina Hale appearing prominently as 2 key links. Gerald Pike was indicted on multiple stacked charges. Lucas's case allowed the federal investigators to expand the file against him. Margaret skimmed only the headlines before folding the paper shut. She didn't want to stare too long at her son's collapse. That afternoon, Eleanor appeared at the door. No coat, no briefcase, just a daughter who looked as if she had run straight from the airport. "Mom!" Eleanor's voice broke. I was wrong." Margaret saw her daughter's shoulders trembling and didn't say a word. She simply opened her arms. Eleanor burst into tears like a child, for the first time since the day Daniel died. "I trusted paperwork, logic, whatever looked correct," Eleanor cried. "I thought Lucas would never do anything wrong. I assumed you were just panicking because of age. I hurt you." Margaret cupped her daughter's cheek, wiping her tears. "What matters is you came back," she said softly. "Families lose their way sometimes, but if they can find each other again, nothing is truly lost." Ben stayed by his mother's side throughout those days, helping her care for the 2 granddaughters, Bella and Lila. The girls didn't fully understand, only that their parents were away for a while. Ben shielded them gently, and Margaret saw in him a reflection of Daniel, kind, decent, unambitious. In the midst of pain, the family still existed, not whole but not shattered beyond repair. A few days later, the skies over Pine Bridge cleared. Margaret took the girls to the backyard garden. She brought pruning shears, gloves, and a bag of seeds Daniel had once loved. "Grandma," Bella asked, "what did Grandpa Daniel like to plant the most?" Margaret smiled softly. "He liked planting everything, as long as he planted it with someone he loved." Lila giggled, "Just like you and us right now." Margaret knelt down, her aging hands pressing into the soil, feeling the soft warmth of the morning. The garden bed slowly filled, not only with new plants, but with the hope she was trying to sow back into her family. When the 3 of them rested beneath the apple tree, Margaret looked at the girls and said, "You know, when someone does wrong, it isn't just the law that punishes them. It's the kindness they abandoned that takes everything away." The girls listened, not fully understanding, but nodding anyway. Margaret exhaled, long and deep. The family's healing journey would be long, but she knew she was on the right path. That night, after the girls were asleep, Margaret sat by the window, watching the warm yellow lights fall across the quiet little street. She thought of the past weeks, of betrayal, of the courage she didn't know she still had, of Clara, Agent Ruiz, and Rachel Mendez, strangers who had stood on her side, and of her family, the very thing that had caused her the deepest pain, yet also the very thing that saved her from despair. In her silent reflection, Margaret realized 3 things. First, respecting older people is not just a matter of politeness. It is acknowledging that their lived experiences are priceless assets. Second, kindness is not weakness. It is a strength capable of shifting the course of a tragedy. Third, family is the place that can hurt us the most, but also the only place where we can truly heal. Before going to bed, Margaret stopped at the small wooden table where Daniel's photo stood. She touched the slightly worn frame. "Daniel," she whispered. "In the end, we protected what mattered most, our children." Outside the window, the night wind glided through the newly planted garden. A new beginning, a family still carrying wounds, but still carrying love enough to mend them. And Margaret knew she had won not just because justice prevailed, but because she had chosen kindness. The path Daniel had always believed was the truest one.